I've never been paranoid, but something changed. Her behavior, her words, even her eyes, everything suddenly became alienating. Before, life with Lori seemed clear and predictable, like a good old movie that you've seen 100 times, but still love. She was my wife, and my daughter Sarah and I were her family. Now, every little thing raised questions. It all started with her frequent meetings with bold friends. I had never even heard of them before. Her phone started to be with her all time, always with a password, like a little safe. Sometimes she would sit in the corner of the room, smiling to herself as she looked at the screen. It was supposed to be innocent, but every time she did, something inside her would clench. Lori used to work as a receptionist in a family clinic. I have always admired her ability to get along with people, even with the most difficult patients. But recently, her job became a kind of holy grail. She could stay there until late at night, explaining that patients need help. I trusted her. At least, I thought I did. One evening I came home earlier than usual. Sarah was already asleep, and Laura not yet there. I saw her cell phone on the kitchen table. It was a text message that said, "A new message." I looked at the screen and my heart broke. "You were incredible today, I can't wait to see you again," it said. The sender, Dr. Lewis. Dr. Lewis, her boss, is our family doctor. I tried to make myself believe that it was some kind of mistake. That it was a joke that I just didn't understand. But the message, it sounded too intimate. Then I decided I had to find out more. No scandal, no shouting. First, I had to understand what was going on. I hardly slept that night. I lay in the dark, listening to Lori come home, her footsteps light, as if she didn't want to wake me. She came into the room. She touched my shoulder. "Are you sleeping?" she whispered. I pretended to be, because I couldn't look her in the eye. The next morning everything was as usual. She smiled, made coffee, and talked to her daughter about school. But her every word sounded hollow. I saw a different person in her, a stranger who wore my wife's face. Sarah was laughing, talking about his drawings, and Lori just nodded, looking at her phone. I made a decision. If the truth was there, in her mysterious phone, I had to find a way to get to it. But it required patience. I couldn't let her know that. Something was. So I was my usual self, I kept up a conversation, played with Sarah, took an interest in her affairs. However, something dark was boiling inside. In the evening, when Lori went to take a shower, I gathered my courage. Her phone was on the dresser. I picked it up, hoping I could unlock it. But the screen required a password. I quietly returned it to its place and sat down on the bed. It was a failure, but stop. I had to find out the truth. The next day, I called my old friend Jack. He worked in IT and knew how to get around digital barriers. We met at a bar, and I told him everything, even though it was painful to tell him. Jack thought about it. "It's risky, Richard, but I can help. There are ways to get access to the phone if you really want it." "I do," I answered without a shadow of a doubt. Jack gave me a program that could synchronize messages and calls from her phone to my computer. "The main thing is that she doesn't notice anything," he warned me. That night, after Lori fell asleep, I downloaded the program to her phone, trying not to give myself away. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding, but I did it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. The next morning I received the first message. It was from him. "How are you? Yesterday was great. Your smile is the best part of my day." My heart clenched with pain, but I continued to read. They agreed to meet again. "Same place," Lori wrote. Now I knew it was true. She was lying to me. And that wasn't enough. I wanted to know everything. Now I was armed with information. Messages, plans, dates, even addresses, everything appeared on my computer screen. Reading it was like stabbing myself in the heart. Every word, every emoji, every little thing tore me apart. From the inside. But I forced myself to continue. It was my only chance to understand how far her betrayal had gone. On Wednesday, when she said she would be late for work, I received a message: "Make sure your husband doesn't suspect anything." They agreed to meet at the same hotel as before. My body felt like it was numb. My brain was working on autopilot. I felt something inside me change. It was no longer just pain. It was anger. Cold, calculated anger. I took a day off under the guise of family business and went to the hotel. My goal was simple: to see them together. I didn't want any more guesswork or speculation. I wanted the truth in all its brutality. When I arrived, I parked my car on the opposite side of the street, overlooking the main entrance. After the hour I spent in the car looking through their message, I saw her enter the hotel. She was smiling, her gait was light, almost playful. It was a completely different face from the one I saw at home. A few minutes later, he came in, Dr. Lewis. He looked around as if he was afraid someone was watching him. Paranoid, but not enough to notice me. I left the car and walked into the lobby. As I watched the desk, I saw them get the room key. I had to summon all my will not to follow away. I realized that the time would come. For now, I stayed in the shadows. In the corridor on their floor, I heard fragments of their voices. They were laughing. We were talking. All my inner strength was directed at not breaking down and causing a scandal. I took out my phone and took a few pictures. They were the proof I needed for the final blow. That evening at home, I behaved as usual. Lori came home late, saying she was late because of paperwork. I watched her chatting casually, talking about imaginary things as if nothing had happened. The confidence in their lies only fueled my anger. Now I had everything: their messages, photos, names, and locations. But it was not enough. A simple denunciation would have been too easy for her. She had to feel the same pain, the same betrayal, that I felt. A plan began to form in my head, and it was more cunning than just making a scene. My head was working like never before. All the information I had collected turned into puzzles in my plan. I didn't want to just expose Lori. I wanted her to feel the same shock, despair, and bitterness that had plagued me. But for this to work, I needed time and allies. The first person I approached was my former neighbor Jennifer. She and I had always been on friendly terms, although we hadn't talked much since she moved away. Jennifer worked as a journalist for a local online publication and always had a nose for a scoop. I called her and told her I needed help. We met in a cafe, where I briefly told her my story. Her eyes lit up with interest. "Do you want me to publish it?" she asked, smiling slightly. "No," I replied, "I want you to help me set a trap. It has to look like an accidental exposure, but with the public effect possible." She agreed to help. We started creating fake social media account. Jennifer knew how to do it almost perfectly: photos, posts, fake friends, everything looked like a real person. This account was to become a key part of my game. The next step was to involve another person, Mark, an old friend of mine from college. He worked as a private detective. When I told him about Lori and showed him the photos, he agreed to help without any further ado. "You need a calm and precise plan," he said, "and we can do it without her even realizing it happened." Mark began tracking their meetings, recording videos and taking photos. He also obtained a list of Dr. Lewis's patients who could be contacted for further testimony. We wanted to know if he was like this only with Lori or if this was his usual practice. At the time, I continued to play the role of a loving husband. Lori didn't even. I suspected that her life was already gradually falling apart. I began to spend more time at home with Sarah, pretending that our family was as happy as ever. But in my heart, I was already a different person, cold, calculating, ready to make the final blow. One evening, while we were having dinner, Lori said, "This week we have a charity dinner at the clinic. I'll need to stay late tonight." I could barely contain my smile. I already knew it was not a charity dinner. It was just another meeting with him. "Okay," I said, looking her in the eye, "I hope this is important." She nodded and looked away. It was her last chance to tell the truth, and she didn't it. The final part of my plan was almost ready. I knew that I needed the right moment when she would feel absolutely safe. And then I would reveal everything. It would not be just an exposure. It would be her destruction. All this time I watched Lori live her life as if nothing had happened. She was a master of duplicity. Her voice remained soft, her smile sincere, and her eyes attentive when she asked me how I spent my day. She laughed at Sarah's jokes and set the table for family dinners. But now, every single one of her. Every word, every gesture seemed like theater to me. I could not understand how she managed to play the role of a wife and mother so well. I, in turn, also played my part. I did not put pressure, did not show my anger or suspicion. Now I was living to see the moment when her illusion of a happy life would crumble. But maintaining this mask was harder than I expected. One evening, when Lori was, in a meeting, I left Sarah at my parents' place and went to the place where she and the doctor were to meet. I stayed at a distance, watching from the car. I saw them through the window of the hotel restaurant. Lori was sitting across from Louis. She was laughing, her hand was on his wrist. They looked like a couple with no secrets. Something in me broke at that moment. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a desecration of everything I had built for her and her love for our daughter. A lie. Our plans for the future. An illusion. I got out of the car and walked to the restaurant. My steps were heavy, confident, and a hurricane was raging inside me. But when I was a few meters away from their table, I stopped. I could have made a scene right there, ripped off their mask in a public place, but I realized that wasn't enough. They would be embarrassed, but they would recover. No, I needed something else. The ending was devastating and inevitable. So I did what I thought was almost impossible, I turned around and left. Lori came home late, as usual. She came quietly into the bedroom, changed, and lay down next me. "Long day," she said, as if she hadn't cuddled with another man recently. I didn't say anything, pretending to be asleep. Her perfume, which I hadn't seen her wear before, mingled with the scent of her betrayal. The next day I received confirmation from Jennifer, the fake account had worked. Louis had replied to a message from a new friend we had made up. He wrote the same things to her as he did to Lori, using the same tricks. We collected compromising material on him to it all together. It was important to me not only to expose Lori, but to destroy his life as well. The tension in the house was growing. Lori began to notice that I was withdrawing. Her questions became more frequent, but I answered dryly, avoidantly. "Is everything okay?" she asked me one evening as I was doing the dishes. "Yes," I answered without even looking at her. Her eyes stayed on me longer than usual. She suspected something. I could feel the web of lies stretching on both sides. She was trying to save her mask, and I was trying to see the plan. A plan that was already beginning to grow into something bigger than of us. The longer I watched Lori, the more I realized that her duplicity was not an accident, it was her way of life. She was so used to this game that she didn't even notice how her actions were pushing me away from her more and more. But instead feeling pain, I started using it to my advantage. The next stage of the plan was to establish control over the situation. To me, I needed Lori to get caught up in the web of her own lies. To do this, I decided to change my tactics. Instead of pulling away, I started showing more attention as if nothing had happened. It was risky, but I knew that the guards will come down if they think I don't suspect anything. One evening, when the three of us were having dinner, I said, "Lori, let's organize an evening with friends next week. Let's invite everyone over and cook something delicious." She was surprised. "Really? You don't mind the extra fuss?" I smiled, knowing how it looked. "No, it'll be fun. Sarah will help me with the desserts." This suggestion was not accidental. Among our friends were people who understood how to detect falsehoods. Although Lori agreed, I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She felt that something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. At the same time, Mark continued to collect evidence. Photos, videos, recordings of conversations. I now had all of this in hand. In addition, I received confirmation from Jennifer that the fake account story worked perfectly. Lewis said he was so fascinated by his new victim that he didn't even pay attention to the minor inconsistencies in her stories. He trusted his charm, and that was his biggest mistake. In the meantime, I started using little tricks to break down Lori's nervous system. I would leave notes on the kitchen table with lists that she didn't recognize. For example, make dessert, order new glasses, confirm the meeting with Jack. She didn't ask directly, but I could see her eyebrows wiggle as she read them. One evening, I deliberately left my laptop open on a page with search queries about family lawyers. When I returned to the room, she was already sitting in front of the screen, pretending to scroll through her messages. "Are you looking for something?" I asked, barely holding back a smile. "No, I just wanted to make sure Sarah didn't forget her project for school," she replied, trying to sound calm. The climax was near. The day of the party came. The house was crowded and noisy, with friends joking and taking pictures. Lori tried to look friendly, but I could see her nervously looking at her phone. For a moment, she disappeared from the room, and I knew where she was going, to check if Lewis had texted her. It was the moment I had been waiting for. I pulled Jennifer aside and whispered briefly, "It's time." She nodded, pulling out her phone. A few minutes later, everyone present heard the sound of a notification when Jennifer posted on the fake account. It was a screenshot of one of Lewis's intimate messages, but with a hint that it was addressed not only to Laura, but to another woman as well. Everyone in the room looked at their phones. Surprised looks. Tense silence. Lori ran back in, visibly pale. She tried to remain calm, but couldn't find the right words. And I just stood there and watched her world begin to come apart at the seams. The room was silent. A ringing silence permeated every corner like a cold wind. People held their phones in their hands, whispered, and stole glances at Lori, who stood pale, as if all the blood had just left her body. She looked back at me, and her eyes were shining with panic. "What is this?" Her voice was trembling, and she looked like a person caught red-handed. I shrugged my shoulders like an innocent bystander and said, "I would like to know." Jennifer, from across the room, smiled playfully as if nothing had happened and went back to talking to the others. But I knew she was watching Lori with every eye. The atmosphere in the room changed. People couldn't take their eyes off Lori, and even those who didn't realize anything yet felt that something was wrong. I don't know what it is," Lori tried to justify herself, but her voice broke on the last word. "Maybe you can explain it to us?" I asked quietly, almost friendly, but every word sounded like a challenge. She began to look around, looking for a way out, but every look, every pair of eyes directed at her became an insurmountable wall. I could see her confidence shattering like fragile glass. Lori hurriedly left the room, leaving her phone on the table. I knew she was trying to come up with an excuse or call Lewis to warn him about what had happened. But I was already ahead of her. Mark, who was still in the dark, sent me a message, "Everything is ready. Lewis has received copies of the messages. He's panicked." I walked over to Lori's phone, picked it up, and returned to the room. "I think we're all wondering what's going on here," I said calmly, showing her phone screen to the guests. The compiled messages I had prepared in advance were now on display. My wife would have to explain why she spends so much time with our family doctor, and why their conversations are so intimate. The room exploded with whispers, people started talking, and Lori returned to the room and saw that things were already out of control. Her lips opened, but no words came out. She tried to say something, but she knew that each phrase would only add to her defeat. Then I took the next step. I turned on the video Mark had recorded on the TV. It was a recording of one of their meetings in the hotel, without sound, but it was enough for everyone to understand what was happening. She was standing next to Louis, their postures close, too close for a professional relationship. "How could you?" I asked, looking her straight in the eye. This time I did not hide my anger. "It's not you think," she began, but this only made some of the audience laugh. "Really?" "Because it looks like that," I replied coldly, watching her squirm in shame. Lori ran out of the room, leaving everything behind. I was left standing in the middle of the guests, who couldn't hide their surprise. This event had already become something was more than just an exposure. It was the beginning of her downfall, her life built on a lie, now crumbling like a house of cards. After the party, all that remained was the hum of silence that nestled in the empty rooms. The guests left, their eyes a mixture of shock and sympathy. No one said anything directly, but I knew that the next day the rumors would spread like wildfire. Every word, every look would be directed at Lori, and that was just the beginning. Lori was gone. She did not return to her bedroom that night. Her belongings were still untouched, and the phone was lying where I had left it. I didn't try to look for it. Instead, I started the next stage of my plan, preparing for the complete destruction of everything she was trying to save. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Sarah was still asleep. I looked at her and felt a weight in my heart. She didn't know what was happening, but she would have to find out soon. It was inevitable. My only goal now was to protect her, even if it meant destroying everything else. Lori returned around noon. She looked exhausted and her eyes were red from crying. She crossed the threshold and saw me, but she couldn't to speak. I felt her fear, her shame, but I did not feel sympathy. She sat down across from me in the kitchen, was silent for a long time, and then finally gathered her strength. "Richard, I can explain everything." Her voice was trembling, but there was still hope for an explanation. I leaned closer. "Lori, I don't want to hear your excuses. I want to know how you look Sarah in the eye after all this." She looked away. That was her weak spot, and I hit her right there. "I made a mistake," she began, but I interrupted her. "A mistake? Is that what you call betrayal? That word sounds too easy for what you did." I contacted a lawyer the same day. I knew that divorce was the only way out and I had to ensure that Sarah stayed with me. Lori didn't even try to argue. She knew she wouldn't win. Mark, meanwhile, put the finishing touches on it. We had a whole dossier on Dr. Louis, his other affairs, which I had uncovered through his negligence, patient testimonies, and even medical ethics violations. I knew that if he went unpunished, he would continue to destroy the lives of others. Therefore, I submitted the material I had collected to a medical commission that was to assess his professional fitness. However, this was only the beginning of the real reckoning. One morning I received a message from Jennifer: "The article is ready. Everything is as we agreed." She had published a story about Dr. Louis, with all the evidence we had gathered. The article mentioned not only his relationship with Lori, but also with other women who had suffered from his manipulations. The news quickly went viral. His name was mentioned on every corner, and it destroyed his reputation. He resigned from the clinic and later had his license suspended. Lori remained in the shadows, silently watching her entire life turn to rubble. She didn't try to re-establish contact, didn't try to convince me to come back. She knew that I had destroyed her world just as she had destroyed mine. Now I was ready for the last move. My plan had come to a climax. Lori remained silent, keeping her distance, but I knew it wasn't. She still had hope of regaining some of what she had lost. I wanted her to feel every drop of the pain she had caused me. I intended to finally pull her out of her comfort zone, to force her to face the truth that she had been trying so hard to hide. One morning I called Laura and coldly said, "Come over tonight. We need to talk." Her voice was tense, but she agreed. I was prepared. On the table was a thin folder with all the materials I had collected, messages, photos, Mark's reports, even the article that had ruined Lewis's career. It was the whole story, recorded on paper. I knew Lori would not escape this moment. She came late in the evening. Sarah was already asleep. Her face was pale and her eyes were tired. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, hunched over as if she was waiting for a verdict. "I made a mistake," she began. Her voice was weak, and she didn't even seem to believe her own words. "A mistake?" I repeated, opening the folder and laying the evidence before her. "This is not a mistake, Lori. This is a systematic lie, betrayal, and destruction of our family." She looked at the photos, messages, everything that was laid out in front of her, and her eyes filled with tears. For the first time, I saw real pain in her eyes, not protection. "I don't know how it all happened," she began, but I stopped her. "You knew, Lori. You knew where this was. You just decided that your pleasure was more important than our family, more important than me, more important than Sarah. And now you've lost everything." That night I told her I was filing for divorce. She didn't even object. She seemed to have accepted her fate. I put forward conditions that meant that Sarah would stay with me. "You have no right to be a mother when you couldn't even be a wife," I told her. These words hit her harder than any scream. But that was not the end. My final revenge was waiting for a public finale. On the day we officially signed the divorce papers, I invited Lori to the law office. Mark was already waiting there with a recording of her meeting with Lewis. She had never seen this recording before. "This is for you," I said, turning on the video. Her hands trembled as she saw herself on the screen. Shame. Anger. Despair. All these emotions flashed across her face. "I'm not. I plan to tell Sarah about it," I added, "but it will stay with me forever. And you will live with it for the rest of your life." The documents were signed, I left, leaving her alone in the cold, empty room. That was the last time I saw her. She was in the past, just like her lies and betrayal. The following weeks were difficult, but I focused on Sarah. She was a ray of light in the midst of all this chaos. I did everything I could to ensure that she had a peaceful and happy childhood, regardless of what happened between me and her mother. Lori disappeared from our lives, and I started from. It was over. I felt a strange emptiness. No relief, no joy, just devastation. Revenge, although it brought me a moment of triumph, did not return. Of what I had lost. My life remained in pieces that needed to be picked up and glued back together. And I realized that it would take time. Sarah became my top priority. We spent more time together than ever before, painting, going to the park, watching her favorite cartoons. She was the part of my life that always remained pure and. Her smile helped me forget about everything I had been through. One day we went to the beach. It was a sunny day off, and Sarah was going to tried to build a sand castle by herself. I sat nearby, watching her. Her laughter, her sincere joy reminded me that not everything in this world is destroyed. I took a deep breath, smelling the salty smell of the sea, and realized that, despite everything, I had a chance to start over. But even on the beach I could feel the stares. Some of our friends who knew what had happened avoided talking. Others tried to express sympathy, which only made me bitterly. I didn't need sympathy. I needed time to rebuild my life. During this period, I unexpectedly met Julia. She worked at a neighboring bank branch where I was filling out some documents. Her warm smile and easy, relaxed way of talking won me over from the first moment. We met a few times by chance, exchanged jokes, and then she invited me for coffee. "I know you've been through something difficult," she said during our first of the meeting. "But you look like a man who knows what he wants." Her words made me think. Did I really know what I wanted? Julia did not ask unnecessary questions about my past. She didn't try to solve my problems, she was just there for me. Her kindness and patience gradually opened up parts of me that I thought were lost. We started meeting more often, first as friends, and later as something more. However, Lori's shadow still haunted me. Sarah asked me one day, "Daddy, is Mommy not coming anymore?" Her words struck me to the heart. I sat down next to her, took her small hand, and gently answered, "Mom will always be your mom. Even if she's not around. But now we are a family, and I will do everything to make you happy." She nodded, her eyes shining with trust. That moment was a turning point. I realized that my life should not be determined by the past. The future was now in my hands. With Julia, we moved slowly but surely. She was different from Lori in every sense. There was no lie in her eyes, only an open desire to build a relationship based on trust. I was in no hurry to introduce her to Sarah, but one day when we went to the park together, Julia joined us. They immediately hit it off. Every day was a step towards a new life. I remained myself, but without the illusions that had haunted me for so long. Lori disappeared from our lives forever. I heard that she had moved to another city and was trying to start over, but that was no longer my problem. I felt that I could trust again. Not only other people, but also myself. And that was the beginning of what I could call a real new life. Time passed, and every day brought new discoveries. I realized that revenge, although it gave me a temporary sense of justice, was not the solution to all my problems. It left a mark in my soul, a deep scar that gradually healed thanks to the care of Sarah and the warm presence of Julia. Life became not just stable, but filled with a meaning that I had almost lost. One morning, I woke up before Sarah did and decided to make breakfast. While I was flipping pancakes on the griddle, my daughter ran out of the room with a toy in her hands. Her face was glowing with happiness. "Daddy, look, I learned how to make a tower out of cubes," she exclaimed. I smiled. "Well, let me see," I replied, and we sat down to build together. At that moment, I realized that everything I had done was not in vain. My task now is to give her the childhood she deserves. No betrayal, no pain could take away from. She is a joy. Julia became an important part of our lives. She did not try to fill the void left by Lori. She was just being herself, honest, patient and gentle. Once she said to me, "I don't want to rush things. You and Sarah have your own story, and I don't want to interfere until you're ready." Her words gave me a sense of confidence. We moved slowly, but every day we opened our hearts to each other more and more. Sarah also began to become attached to Julia. She called her "my friend Julia" and often invited her to play. I could see how carefully Julia was building trust between them, and it made me respect her even more. One day we went on a family picnic. In the woods, Sarah was running through the grass, catching butterflies. Julia joined her, laughing, and I sat, watching them. The picture was perfect, almost unrealistic. For the first time in a long time, I felt really happy. "You look thoughtful," Julia said as she sat down next to me. She had this gift of seeing me for who I was. "I think that for the first time in many years I have everything I want," I replied. She didn't ask me what I She just took hand, her touch was warm and soothing. But life is not always perfect. One day Lori sent me in. It was the first message from her in several months after the divorce. In the letter she wrote about how sorry she was for everything that had happened and how she was trying to start over. She mentioned Sarah and asked for permission to see her. I held the letter in my hands for a long time, thinking about what to do. In the end, I realized that it was not my decision. It was for Sarah to decide when she was older. I put the letter in the boxes with other things that belonged to the past. Now I was focusing on the future. Every new day was a testament to the fact that life can be restored. My family, although not what I had imagined before, became my salvation. We learned together, made mistakes together, and grew together. Years passed, and life took on a new dimension. Sarah grew up to be a smart and cheerful girl who could melt anyone's heart with her laughter. Julia became a real support for us, but I was never in a hurry to make her an official part of our family. I wanted everything to happen naturally, without pressure or haste. One evening, as we were all sitting on the couch watching a family movie, Sarah suddenly said, "Dad, why doesn't Julia live with us?" Her question was so simple, but it stopped me in my tracks. I looked at Julia, who was also smiling in surprise, and suddenly realized that this question had been long overdue. A few months later, we took the next step. Julia moved in with us, and it was like the beginning of a new chapter. Everything was easy, no drama, no tension. She and Sarah became inseparable, and I saw my fears and doubts melting away day by day. One special day, at a family picnic, I finally made up my mind. I took a small box out of my pocket and turned to Julia. "You are already a part of our life. You make it better, and I want to make it official. Will you be my wife?" Sarah jumped for joy when she heard these words. Julia paused for a moment. She looked at me and then smiled, "Yes." It was the "yes" that ended a long and painful chapter of my life, opening a new one, warm and bright. What happened to Lori? She remained a shadow of the past. She occasionally wrote letters to Sarah, which I put aside until Sarah was ready to read them herself. Her choices had distanced her from us, and that was the price of her mistakes. But I no longer held a grudge against her. Life had taught me that the best revenge is happiness. And now I had it. On the day of my wedding to Julia, Sarah was a little flower girl running around with a basket of petals. I looked at her, at Julia, at everyone who came to support us, and realized that this was the life I had always wanted. The past no longer held me captive. I had built my future, and it was as strong as the foundation I had been laying for myself and my daughters. Life does not always go according to plan, but sometimes it brings something better than we could have imagined. Betrayal, despair, and anger were left behind as a lesson that shaped me. A new life full of hope, love, and true happiness was ahead.